The Divine Comedy by Dante, and especially its first part, the Inferno, is without a doubt one of, if not the best-known piece of medieval literature. Pretty much everyone has at least heard of it and knows something about it, even if they've never read it. And that's probably because of its huge cultural impact. Dante wasn't the first to write a narrative following a journey through the afterlife, but his masterful ability at painting incredibly vivid pictures with his words led his vision of hell, purgatory, and heaven to have a profound impact on Western Christians, and, as an extension, Western culture more broadly up until the present day. But despite its seeming universality, the Divine Comedy is also deeply tied to Dante's own day and age, and it's very much influenced by theological and philosophical ideas of the late 13th and early 14th centuries. It's also involved in the history of 13th century Italy, as well as the history and stories which educated people at the time saw as foundational for the world in which they lived. And one good way to see some of this is through the characters that appear in the text. The Divine Comedy, much like a modern Marvel movie, is full of cameos meant to make the reader do like that Leonardo DiCaprio pointing meme. But not all of those characters are going to be immediately obvious to today's readers, though some definitely are. So I thought it might be fun to go through every single character that appears in each of the three parts of the Divine Comedy and briefly explain who they are and why Dante puts them there. Some are more obvious than others, and some have a lot more known about them than others. One thing's for sure, though, there are a hell of a lot of them, so without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, I lied. There is further ado. I just want to briefly explain two things before we start. First of all, I'm only going to mention characters who actually appear in the Inferno, not those who are just mentioned. The reason for this being that there are so many allegories, similes, metaphors, and tangents that I'd be doubling the length of this video if I did. Plus, many of those characters appear later in the poem anyway, so I'd rather discuss them in one of the next two videos when they actually show up. There are a few exceptions for when the mention has real significance, and by that I typically mean when the dead talk about someone who's still alive, who will be joining them after they die. I also want to mention that I'm using the Durling and Martinez Oxford University Press translation. It's a great recent translation with excellent notes, and a lot of the information in this video, especially about more obscure characters as well as Dante's sources and understanding of certain stories, is coming from these notes. Now let's get into it. The first character in the Inferno is, of course, Dante himself. Dante Alighieri was born in Florence in 1265, and in order to understand his life and much of the Divine Comedy, you have to know a bit about Italy in the 13th century. Italy, in practice northern Italy, was part of the Holy Roman Empire, an empire based in today's Germany whose emperors were typically German. The name comes from the fact that they were seen as the successors to the classical Roman Empire, and they were crowned as emperors by the popes, the bishops of Rome. But for a long time there had been a lot of conflict between the emperors and the popes, and by the 13th century, Italy was generally split between a faction who supported the pope's authority in Italy, the Guelphs, named after the House of Guelph, who had in the past allied with the popes, and those who supported the emperor, the Ghibellines, after Weiblingen, a castle which belonged to the Stauffer emperors. So, back to Dante, his family were well-off Florentine Guelphs. He got a good education and was involved early on in public life. We know that in 1289 he took part in a military campaign against the Ghibelline city of Arezzo, which helped solidify Guelph dominance in Florence, and when the Florentine Guelphs split further into white and black Guelphs, he was part of the whites. During this time he also wrote poetry and was involved in Florence's literary circles. He was also involved in politics, and in 1300 he was elected as one of the 6 priori, who were the highest civic authorities in Florence. Unfortunately, Dante's involvement in politics had major consequences. The Pope, Boniface VIII, favored the Black Guelphs, and in 1301, he had Charles of Valois, brother of King Philip IV of France, march into Florence and execute or exile the white leaders. Dante was on a diplomatic mission to Rome at the time, and he would never be allowed to return to his home on pain of death. unless he paid a large fine, which he had neither the means nor inclination to pay. For the first few years, Dante tried to gain support to wrestle Florence from the Black Guelphs. He even came to support the Emperor Henry VII by around 1309, but he eventually gave up. From 1302 to his death in 1321, Dante would travel from court to court, living as a guest of several lords. It's during this exile that Dante wrote the Divine Comedy, with the Inferno being published in 1314. As you'll see, these events will be relevant throughout the poem. However, the poem itself is set in 1300, before Dante's exile, so the figures who appear are those who've died by around April of that year. Anyway, that's going to be the longest description in this video. We've still got about 187 more characters to go. Outside of hell, Dante gets harassed by some animals, who have important symbolism but are not relevant to this video. The first person he meets is Virgil, who will be Dante's guide throughout a large part of his journey. Virgil was a Roman poet from the 1st century BC who was a huge inspiration for Dante. Any medieval poet worth their salt would have read Virgil, especially the Aeneid, an epic poem about the Trojan ancestor of Rome's founders, Aeneas, and his journey from Troy to Italy. Dante was inspired by Virgil both in terms of poetic style, but also content, since Virgil wrote about Aeneas journeying through the underworld. Virgil therefore was quite familiar with the underworld, hence why he guides Dante through it. Upon entering the gate to hell, they see the neutrals, those who lived their lives neither in fame nor infamy, and so they kind of just chill on the outskirts of hell forever. They're inherently anonymous, so Dante doesn't name any of them, but he does point out one cowardly neutral who scholars have tried to identify over the years without full consensus, but a popular interpretation is that this is Pope Celestine V. Celestine was pope for only 5 months before he resigned. He was succeeded by Boniface VIII, the one who exiled Dante, and it was believed that Boniface pressured Celestine to do so. Celestine therefore was not bad, but his resignation allowed for Boniface to rise to power, making him not good either. Next up we meet Charon, ferrying the damned across the river Acheron at the entrance to hell. Charon is one of the many characters from the Inferno from Greco-Roman myth, where he does the same thing, carrying the dead to the underworld. He's also one of many characters who appears pretty much the same as he does in Virgil's Aeneid, though Dante specifies that Charon is a demon. The two then arrive at the outermost circle of hell, Limbo. This is a place for those who didn't sin, but aren't eligible to go to heaven because they weren't baptized, including infants who died before they could be baptized. It's not really a bad place, it's just not heaven. Here Dante lists a bunch of admirable non-Christians, mostly, though not exclusively, Greek and Roman pagans. He first encounters some famous poets, the Greek Homer, the author of the famous Iliad and Odyssey, who Dante never read but he knew about him through other works, and the Romans, Horace, known for his lyric poetry, Ovid, best known for his Metamorphoses, one of Dante's main sources about classical myth, and Lucan, known for his historical epic De Bello Civili. This is also where Virgil typically hangs out, and they invite Dante to be the 6th member of their little club. He's not exactly being modest here, though I guess history has vindicated this passage. They then pass through a castle where they meet a bunch of others hanging out in a meadow. There's Electra, not the daughter of Agamemnon, but the mythical mother of the founder of Troy, Hector, the Trojan prince and hero who died fighting Achilles in the Trojan War, Aeneas, who I've mentioned already, a refugee from Troy after the Trojan War who would go to Italy and whose descendants would be the Romans, and Julius Caesar, a Roman politician who would become dictator of the Roman Republic, and who was supposedly a direct descendant of Aeneas. Dante saw him as the founder of the Roman Empire, which Dante was a big fan of. Remember, he supported the Holy Roman Emperor's authority in Italy by this point, and saw that empire as the same thing as Caesar's empire. They also see Camilla, a warrior woman from the Volscian tribe in Italy who fought Aeneas. Dante doesn't pick favorites here. Penthesilea, an Amazon queen who fought alongside the Trojans, the Italian king Latinus, and his daughter Lavinia, who married Aeneas, though this didn't prevent war between the Trojans and Latins. Next, they see Brutus, the founder of the Roman Republic, who, according to tradition, drove out the last king of Rome after his son, Tarquin, raped the noble lady Lucretia and drove her to suicide, not to be confused with his descendant, the younger Brutus, who we'll see much later. Speaking of which, Lucretia herself is also here, despite her suicide, which, as we'll see, Dante considers a sin. She's joined by other important Roman women: Cornelia, Caesar's wife, Julia, their daughter, and Marcia, the wife of Cato the Younger, who we'll see in Purgatory. Nearby, they also see someone perhaps unexpected: Saladin, or Salah ad-Din, the founder of the Ayyubid dynasty of Egypt who captured Jerusalem, prompting the Third Crusade. Now, Dante wasn't a fan of Islam, and he was a supporter of the Crusades, but by his time, Saladin had become a legendary figure even in Christian Europe, on par with the likes of Hector or King Arthur, especially in the romances of the troubadours with which Dante was quite familiar, which is why Dante places him here. Next, Virgil and Dante look up to see the master of those who know, by which Dante is referring to probably the most influential philosopher in history, the ancient Athenian Aristotle. By Dante's day, Aristotle was at the peak of his popularity, and all of his works had been translated into Latin. Then follows a bunch of other ancient Greek philosophers. Closest to Aristotle are the other two most influential: Aristotle's teacher Plato, who had a huge influence on early Christianity, and Plato's teacher Socrates, the annoying gadfly of Athens, as he was nicknamed, since he was constantly pestering people in public. Then there are others: Democritus, the inventor of atomic theory, Anaxagoras, who developed the idea that the world was made of a single substance and given shape and character by the nous, or cosmic divine intellect, Diogenes, likely not the infamous cynic, but rather Anaxagoras' student who saw air as both the archaic substance and the cosmic intellect, Thales, often said to be the first philosopher, who theorized that everything was made out of water, Empedocles, who theorized that everything was made out of the four elements of fire, water, earth, and air, Heraclitus, who is best known for his concept of unity in opposites and of constant change or flux in everything, and Zeno, known for his paradoxes meant to disprove the concepts of space and motion. After the philosophers comes Dioscorides, the father of pharmacology, whose work was still the basis of most pharmacological texts by Dante's time. Dante had to join a guild in order to hold office in Florence, and he joined the guild of doctors and apothecaries, so he was probably quite familiar with Dioscorides, though whether Dante ever actually practiced medicine is unclear as far as I'm aware. Anyway, he next sees Orpheus, the mythological poet and musician who had also journeyed through the underworld, then Tullius, i.e. Cicero, the Roman politician, orator, and philosopher who was one of the most influential ancient authors in the Middle Ages, writing on topics such as justice, ideal politics, and natural law. Then Linus, another mythical musician like Orpheus, and Seneca the Younger, the Roman Stoic philosopher who Dante calls the moralist. Finally, the two notice one last group, which includes Euclid, the father of geometry, Ptolemy, the Roman-Egyptian astronomer who was still the main authority on astronomy and astrology at the time, and the physicians, Hippocrates, the father of rational medicine, Galen, the Roman-Greek physician who was just as influential as Hippocrates, and two more Muslims, Averroes, or Ibn Rushd, and Avicenna, or Ibn Sina, both of whom had a huge impact on medieval Christian medicine and other areas of philosophy as well. And that's it for Limbo. But before we leave, I should mention that this is also where many Old Testament figures were placed before Christ's crucifixion, since they couldn't be cleansed of original sin before then. But in the time between Christ's death and his resurrection, he came down and yanked a bunch of them up to heaven in an event known as the Harrowing of Hell. We'll see some of them when we get to the Paradiso. As Virgil and Dante head towards the second circle, they meet Minos, the mythical king of Crete who, as he does in the Aeneid, judges the souls of the dead to determine their punishment, which, for Dante, translates to which circle of hell they'll be placed in. The second circle is that of the carnal sinners, the lustful, who get blown around by a great wind and tumble about for the rest of eternity. Kind of sounds like fun, actually. The first person they see there is Semiramis, the legendary wife of the founder of Babylon, who supposedly legalized incest, since she was a little too close to her son. Next is Dido, the legendary founder queen of Carthage who fell in love with Aeneas and killed herself when he left her. Then Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt who was, by Dante's time, infamous for her love affairs with Caesar and Mark Antony. She was also married to her brother, though that wasn't exactly by choice. They also see Helen of Sparta and Paris of Troy, whose love affair caused the Trojan War, since Helen was the wife of King Menelaus of Sparta, and Paris was the son of King Priam of Troy. Achilles is also there, the greatest warrior amongst the Greeks who attacked Troy. He's here because it was his love of Paris' sister Polyxena which led to his death, at least in the version of the story Dante was familiar with. Next is a character from Arthurian romance, Tristan, nephew to King Mark of Cornwall, whose affair with Mark's wife, Isolde, led to both of their deaths. Finally, we see a pair from Dante's own time, Francesca da Rimini and Paolo Malatesta. Francesca was from the Polenta family of Ravenna, and she was married to Paolo's brother, Gianciotto. But, similarly to the case of Tristan, Gianciotto uncovered Francesca and Paolo's love affair and killed them both in around 1285. That brings us to the third circle, that of the gluttons, who are tormented by Cerberus, the three-headed dog who guards the underworld in Greco-Roman mythology. His place here is probably because of the connection between dogs and insatiable hunger and willingness to eat anything, as well as the fact that he has 3 mouths. The only sinner we meet here is Ciacco, an affluent Florentine from Dante's time who's otherwise unknown, though his name means pig, so it's probably a nickname referring to his well-known gluttony at the time. The fourth circle, that of the greedy and of reckless spenders, sees the two groups constantly charging at each other in some sort of infernal wall of death. Actually, probably much slower since the rolling giant waits at each other. Watching over them is Plutus, the god of wealth, who shouts some demonic gibberish. Dante calls him Pluto in Italian, which has led to some confusion, but the god of the underworld, who Dante usually refers to as Dis, is equated by him to the devil, as we'll see at the end of the Inferno. Amongst the sinners, Virgil points out that many of them are tonsured, i.e. that they're members of the clergy, and Dante wants to look around, sure that he'll recognize some, but Virgil tells him not to bother, since they are now unrecognizable. This is clearly a reference to how widespread greed and corruption were in the church at the time, at least according to Dante, which he saw as a major cause of the problems of his own day, alongside political factionalism. Otherwise, there are no specific characters. The fifth circle is that of the violently angry, those who can't control their temper, who wallow in the swamps along the river Styx. Dante and Virgil are carried across the river by another mythical ferryman, Phlegyas, a king of Thessaly who was killed by the god Apollo after burning down his temple at Delphi as revenge for Apollo's rape of his daughter. Regardless of whether you think this outburst was justified, it was violent anger, but at least he's not stuck in the mud with the others. We meet one sinner here, Filippo Argenti, who crawls onto the boat as they cross. He was a black Guelph from Florence who, according to Boccaccio, writing shortly after Dante's death, was infamous for his bad temper. Dante even has him bite himself in anger as he's pushed back into the river. They then stop at the walls of the inner hell, also called Dis, like the devil, which is as far as Aeneas got in the Aeneid. While they're trying to figure out how to get in, they're stopped by 3 furies, Megara, Alecto, and Tisiphone, who also stopped Aeneas from entering and who are probably there mostly because of Virgil's account. Furies are underworld beings associated with vengeance, and these 3 were said to punish the dead for various crimes. They call on Medusa to come out and turn Dante into stone. Medusa was a once beautiful woman turned into a monster with snakes for hair by the goddess Minerva, who was killed by the Greek hero Perseus. Looking at her could turn one into stone, for which reason Dante turns around, and it's never actually clear whether she really shows up or not, since he doesn't see her. The gates of Dis are then finally blown open by an angel who comes down to help Virgil and Dante, but we never get his name. Regardless, the 2 enter the walls and reach the 6th circle, that of the heretics, who are all lying in tombs that are on fire. Virgil points out the Greek philosopher Epicurus, a materialist who, amongst other things, didn't believe in an immortal soul, which is the specific heresy of his that Dante is focused on, following St. Augustine. Next, Dante sees an open tomb containing a man he calls Farinata, aka Manente degli Uberti, who'd been a leader of the Florentine Ghibellines until his death in 1264. He's here because he was posthumously condemned by the Inquisition as a Cathar, one of the major heresies of the Middle Ages. Next to him is Cavalcante de Cavalcanti, a Florentine Guelph and father to Dante's friend and fellow poet Guido, who actually married Farinata's daughter. Dante guesses Cavalcante's identity based on his words and his location in this circle, meaning he was likely known for his heretical beliefs, but the specifics of those beliefs aren't entirely clear. Dante then sees some other tombs, including that of Frederick II. Frederick was a king of Sicily and Holy Roman Emperor whose reign in the early 13th century saw an escalation in Guelph-Ghibelline conflict in Italy, and who had a rather tumultuous relationship with the popes. He was excommunicated 4 separate times. He was also known for his religious skepticism, which led him to hold some unorthodox beliefs. A common accusation against him was that he was an Epicurean, i.e., that he denied the immortality of the soul, and possibly that he denied the efficacy of prayers, though it's sometimes hard to tell which accusations were real and which were Guelph propaganda. Dante clearly believed at least some of it, though. Near Frederick is also the tomb of an unnamed cardinal, probably Ottavio degli Ubaldini, likely here because he supposedly once said that if he had a soul, he'd lost it 100 times for the Ghibellines. Lastly, Dante sees the tombs of Anastasius and Photinus. Anastasius is Pope Anastasius II, who was widely considered a heretic due to his attempts at mending the Cassian schism in the late 5th century. To make a long story short, the Council of Chalcedon in 451 had declared Monophysitism heretical, but the Monophysites, who call themselves Miaphysites, there's a difference but I don't have time to go over it here, had a very strong presence in the Levant and Egypt, and so Acacius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, developed a sort of middle ground compromise position, which pissed off a lot of strong supporters of Chalcedon, especially in the West. Anastasius tried to end the schism through tolerance of the Miaphysites and the supporters of Acacius, but this just led to another schism between his supporters and the hardliners, who labeled him a heretic. Photinus, on the other hand, was one of Acacius's disciples, thus a heretic to Dante, who pleaded to Anastasius for reconciliation, which is why Dante says he's the one who led Anastasius astray. Next up is the 7th circle, that of the violent, split into subsections, the first being those violent against others. They first encounter the Minotaur, the bestial half-man, half-bull offspring of King Minos' wife Pasiphae and his prized white bull, which was so violent and bloodthirsty that the king had a massive labyrinth built to contain the Minotaur and regularly fed it young captives. The Minotaur torments the violent sinners alongside other mythological beastmen, the half-man, half-horse centaurs. The centaurs, like most other half-animal hybrids from Greco-Roman myth, were often tied to bestial feral violence. 3 of the centaurs are named: Nessus, who was killed by Hercules after trying to steal his wife Deianira; Chiron, the wise centaur who served as the teacher of Hercules and Achilles, and became the constellation Sagittarius after his death; and Pholus, who entertained Hercules at his home and who Virgil and Ovid both say was especially violent. The human sinners are submerged in a river of boiling blood. Nessus guides Dante and Virgil along the river while pointing out several tyrants. First is Alexander the Great, the Macedonian king who conquered the Persian Empire by the age of 32, and was rumored to be rash, impulsive, stubborn, and violent. Next is Dionysius I of Syracuse, who took control of Syracuse in a coup and was infamous for his cruelty. He then points to 2 Italian tyrants, Azzolino III da Romano, the cruel Ghibelline lord of Treviso, and Obizzo II da Este, the similarly cruel lord of Ferrara. Next, though not explicitly named, is the Anglo-Norman aristocrat Guy de Montfort, who assassinated his cousin Henry of Cornwall in a church in Viterbo in 1271, as revenge for his father and brother's deaths at the Battle of Evesham 6 years earlier. Nessus then lists several more tyrants who are fully submerged deeper in the river: Attila the Hun, the Hunnic warlord who invaded the Roman Empire and shook it to its knees; Pyrrhus of Epirus, a Greek king who fought against the Roman Republic, after whom Pyrrhic victories are named, since he never lost a battle against the Romans, but the battles were so costly that he still lost the war; and Sextus, probably Sextus Pompeius, son of Pompey the Great, who took Sicily and opposed the Second Triumvirate after his father's death. Notice how Dante labels as tyrant anyone who waged war against what he sees as the legitimate secular government, Rome, though I don't think anyone would deny that Attila the Hun was a violent man. Finally, Nessus also names Rinier da Corneto and Rinier Pazzo, 2 infamous 13th century highwaymen from Tuscany. The next section of the circle is for those violent towards themselves, containing a poisonous forests where the damned are harassed by harpies. Here, those who committed suicide are transformed into sentient prickly bushes, which bleed and feel pain when their branches are broken. Though none of them are named, we know from the story he tells that one is Pietro della Vigne, a bureaucrat of Frederick II's court who killed himself after being arrested on charges of corruption and conspiracy. There's another, who's a Florentine, though no one has been able to conclusively identify him. Patricia MacKinnon suggests he may be a symbol of the self-harming factionalism which Dante saw to be plaguing Florence amongst other cities in Italy. Those who were violent against themselves by squandering their wealth and ruining themselves financially are chased through these thorny bushes by dogs. The two of these Dante sees are Lano, aka Arcolano da Squarcia, a Sienese spendthrift who sought death in battle because of his debts, and Jacopo da Santo Andrea, who supposedly once emptied a bag of coins into the water during a boat trip because he was bored. The final section of the Circle of the Violent is for those violent towards God. They have to spend the rest of eternity in a hot desert where it rains fire. The first soul encountered here by Dante and Virgil is Capaneus, one of 7 kings who besieged Thebes in classical myth, who was a great warrior, but extremely arrogant. He taunted the gods, saying that none could stop him from assaulting Thebes and challenging Zeus to strike him down, which he did. It should be noted that since Dante's a Christian, he sometimes sees events like these as having been done by the Christian god, though the acts of pagan gods are also sometimes attributed to demons. The rest of those against God are sodomites, that is, people who engage in non-procreative sex, which typically means homosexual acts. Sodomy was seen as violence against God because it was considered counter-natural, a direct affront to God's command to be fruitful and multiply, the only legitimate venue for sexual activity. It was often euphemistically called the unnatural sin. None of the people Dante mentions here are known for homosexual acts outside of the Inferno, which has led some to argue that Dante meant something else here. But there's plenty of hints in the text which refer indirectly, or again, euphemistically, to homosexuality, not to mention that Dante elsewhere makes clear that sodomy to him means gay sex. So it's still fairly widely accepted, as it was to Dante's near contemporaries like Boccaccio, that these people are here because of their homosexual acts. Medieval society also tended to have a we don't talk about it attitude towards homosexuality. So for Dante to know, or suspect, things about people that don't get discussed in chronicles or other sources is unsurprising. And Dante knew the first of the sodomites, Brunetto Latino, quite well. Brunetto was a Florentine poet, statesman, and intellectual who was a teacher to Dante, and a man Dante looked up to, inspiring his love of poetry. Durling and Martinez note that there are hints in the interaction which may indicate Brunetto had once made advances on Dante, but Dante seems to have refused them. Brunetto is with a group of intellectual sodomites and lists some of his companions. These include the famed 6th century Latin grammarian Priscian, who, again, no sources mention his homosexuality, and Dante would have been too far removed to have any special knowledge about him, so Boccaccio suggests he was a stand-in for grammar teachers in general, who had a reputation at the time for having sexual relationships with their young pupils. More contemporary are Francesco da Corso, a lawyer and son of a famed jurist from Bologna who served as a counselor to King Edward I of England, and Andrea de Mozzi, who is not named but clearly referenced by the events mentioned. He was Bishop of Florence from 1287, but after accusations of abuse, some of which Dante seems to suggest was related to his sodomy, he was transferred in 1294 to Vicenza. Finally, Dante encounters 3 Tuscan nobles dancing naked in a circle: Guido Guerra, a leading Guelph who fought at the Battle of Benevento in 1266, Tagliaio Aldobrandi, another noble Guelph, and Jacopo Rusticucci, known to have had a poor relationship with his wife, which Dante seems to suggest drove him into the arms of men. They also mention another who was recently deceased and would soon be joining them, Guglielmo Borsiere, probably also a nobleman, but little else is known about him. Next up is a long one, the 8th circle, that of fraud, divided into 10 pockets. On their way there, they encounter Geryon, a hybrid creature defeated by Hercules, which is described in the Aeneid as being 3-bodied. Dante gives him the face of a man, the body of a serpent, and the claws of a bear, the human face representing the outward charm of a fraudster, while the serpentine body shows the real intentions behind that face. Geryon will carry Dante and Virgil down to the 8th circle. But before that, Dante sees a bunch of moneylenders who fraudulently multiply their wealth, as the common criticism against them went. In the poem, Dante doesn't recognize them, but he describes the crests on their money pouches, which the audience would have. One has a yellow purse with a blue lion, the Guelph Gianfigliazzi family of Florence, possibly Catello di Rosso Gianfigliazzi, who worked in France. Another has a red bag with a white goose, the Ghibelline Obriachi family, well-known Florentine bankers and lenders. The third has a white purse with a blue sow, the Scrovegni of Padua, possibly Reginaldo Scrovegni, who died in 1290. Reginaldo then makes reference to a certain Vitaliano, likely Vitaliano del Dente, his son-in-law, who he expects to join them once he dies. He also notes how they anticipate the arrival of a knight with a bag adorned with 3 goats, likely in reference to Giovanni di Buomonte de' Becci. It wasn't uncommon for moneylenders to use their wealth to gain titles like that of knight. Carried by Geryon, then, they arrive at the first pocket of the 8th circle, containing panders and seducers, who are being whipped by horned demons. Funny, I thought hell was supposed to be a miserable place. They first see the Bolognese nobleman, Venedico Caccianemico, who prostituted his sister Gisolabella to a Marchese. After him, Virgil points out the Greek hero Jason, known for his adventure to Colchis to obtain the golden fleece of the winged ram Chrysomalos. He's here because of his seduction and deception of Hypsipyle on Lemnos, who he impregnates and then abandons to continue his journey to Colchis. They didn't put that part in the movie. On to the next pocket then, containing flatterers, who are immersed in human waste. Dante spots Alessio Interminei of Lucca, who is otherwise unknown beyond the fact he must have lived in the late 13th century, since Dante says he recognizes him. Virgil then points out Thais, a prostitute from Terence's play The Eunuch. Dante knew her from Cicero's work on friendship, where he cites her telling her clients what they want to hear as a prime example of how flatterers exaggerate to get what they want. The third pocket contains simoniacs, les Simonac in French, those guilty of simony, which is the sin of buying and selling the power of laying on of hands, i.e. channeling the Holy Spirit to bless and perform sacraments. In practice, this meant the buying and selling of ecclesiastical offices, since you have to be a priest to do so, though most simoniacs were doing so for the profits of church land and the power of episcopal titles, rather than the ability to perform sacraments. Simony is named after Simon Magus, Simon the magician, who, surprise surprise, is here in the pocket, though they don't actually see him, only mention that he's here. He was so impressed by the power of the apostles as they gave the Holy Spirit to the people of Samaria that he offered to pay Peter to gain this ability, but Peter refused. The simoniacs are stuck headfirst in narrow holes in the ground with their legs flailing in the air, and on fire because, it's hell. Dante finds a pair of legs belonging to one who calls himself the son of a she-bear, i.e. Pope Nicholas III, whose family, the Orsini, used a she-bear as their emblem. Nicholas was infamous for his simony and nepotism during his tenure as pope. He mistakes Dante for Boniface VIII, who was still alive in 1300, but who Nicholas is awaiting since he'll die in 1303. As I've mentioned, Boniface was the pope who plotted with the Black Guelphs of Florence and had Dante exiled, but he was also known for his corruption, which included simony. Along with this, he was reputed to have bribed the electors who chose him to be pope, and he treated the church's lands like his personal property, selling it and exploiting it at will. Nicholas also says there will be another fraudulent shepherd after Boniface, referring to the current pope while Dante was writing, Clement V. Clement brought the papacy to Avignon, where it would remain for 70 years, and created several French cardinals among other acts meant to appease King Philip IV of France, for which Dante saw him as a corrupt sellout. On to the fourth pocket we meet the diviners, those who seek knowledge of the future or of divine things, through, from the medieval intellectual point of view, demonic means. They have their heads twisted backwards on their bodies. First is Amphiaraus, another of the 7 kings against Thebes, who used augury to determine that he and 5 of the other kings would die before the end of the siege. Next is Tiresias, who magically turned into a woman for 7 years and pissed off the goddess Juno when he revealed that women actually enjoy sex more than men. Juno then blinded him, and Jupiter granted him the ability to see the future as compensation. After Tiresias is his daughter Manto, who assisted him in his divination. She's also the legendary founder of Virgil's home, Mantua. Next is Eurypylus, who went to the Oracle of Delphi to determine the outcome of the Trojan War. After these classical figures, we see some more contemporary diviners. Michael Scott, who translated several works on divination from Arabic and Greek, and wrote some of his own, as well as Guido Bonatti. Both of these men were astrologers in the employ of Frederick II, who took it very seriously, another one of his controversial stances. Besides them, there's also a man from Parma called Asdente, a cobbler who became famous as a soothsayer. After him, Dante notes the presence of countless fortune-telling herbwomen, not an uncommon phenomenon at the time. Next, we come to the fifth pocket, that of the grafters, that is, those who take bribes, especially to change verdicts, where they're dunked in boiling pitch and attacked by demons if they protrude from it. One demon comes and throws in an elder from Lucca, who the early commentator Guido da Pisa identifies as Martino Bottaio, a political leader who died around then. The demon says that all the leaders of Lucca are grafters except Bonturo Dati, clearly meant to be sarcastic since he was known for that, and sarcasm was a common trope for demons in medieval narratives. Some other demons then fish out a Navarrese man who early commentators called Ciampolo. We know nothing about him beyond what Dante tells us. He was an illegitimate son who became a corrupt official of King Thibaut II of Navarre. Ciampolo then tells us about two others, Brother Gomita, an official over Galluria in Sardinia who was hanged for his disloyalty and bribe-taking, and Michele Zanche, another corrupt Sardinian official who served in the region of Logudoro. Several of the demons here, collectively called the Malebranche, or evil claws, are named. Some of them may be original to Dante, but there's a clear inspiration from the naming conventions of demons in popular miracle plays, the most obvious of which is Alecchino, Harlequin, a common stock demon character who was often the leader. The other demons are Malacoda, Evil Tail, Cagnazzo, Evil Dog, Libicoccio, Love Notch, Dragignazzo, Little Big Dragon, Ciriato, Big Pig, Rubicante, Ruby Face, Scarmiglione, Tanglehead, Calcabrina, Tramplefrost, Barbariccia, Curly Beard, Graffiacane, Scratching Dog, and Farfarello, Butterfly. Keep in mind, not all of these translations are universally agreed upon, and many translators will just keep their Italian names rather than translating them. Okay, now on to the sixth pocket, that of the hypocrites, who walk around in heavy robes lined with lead. First they see two men from Bologna, Catalano dei Malavolti and Loderingo degli Andalo, both of whom were members of the religious order, the Knights of the Militia of the Glorious Blessed Virgin Mary, nicknamed the Jolly Friars, an order founded in 1260 to promote civil peace in factionally divided Italy, who were prohibited from holding political offices. Nonetheless, these two were jointly appointed podestà, the highest office in Florence at the time, in 1266 to mediate between the Guelphs and Ghibellines. Despite this, anti-Ghibelline violence swept the city in 1267, which Dante claims they promoted. On the ground, nailed to a cross and being trampled by the others, Dante then sees Caiaphas, the high priest of Jerusalem who pushed for Jesus to be crucified. According to medieval tradition, this was to silence Christ's criticism of his hypocrisy. Next to Caiaphas is his father-in-law, Annas, similarly crucified, who was also on the governing council of Jerusalem and also voted to condemn Jesus. Seventh pocket now, and it's that of the thieves, in a pit full of snakes and lizards restraining and biting them, causing them to metamorphosize into snakes themselves. The first thief is Vanifucci, who in 1293 tried to steal silver tablets with images of the Virgin Mary and the Apostles from the church of San Zeno in Pistoia. Virgil then points out the centaur Cacus, who's here rather than with the other centaurs because he once stole cattle from Hercules and was killed by him because of it. One of the serpents is Cianfa, possibly Cianfa Donati, of whom little is known. It attacks Agnel, that is Agnello Brunelleschi, of whom likewise little is known. Others there are Buoso, possibly Buoso Donati, Puccio Schianciato, Puccio de Galigai, and Francesco de Cavalcanti, the only one of the bunch we really know anything about, though not about his theft so much as the fact that he was murdered by some people from Gavile, and his family avenged him by brutalizing that town, which Dante makes reference to, and is how we know he's referring to Francesco since he's not actually named. Next is the eighth pocket of those who counsel fraud, who are, rather classically, engulfed in flames. One flame holds Ulysses and Diomedes, both Greeks who took part in the Trojan War. Ulysses, perhaps better known by his Greek name Odysseus, was the one who came up with the idea of the Trojan horse, a massive wooden horse built as an offering by the Greeks who were supposedly giving up on their attempt to conquer Troy, but which actually contained Greek warriors ready to open the gates once the Trojans brought it into their walls and fell asleep. Diomedes was one of the Greeks' best warriors, and the two of them recruited Achilles despite knowing that he was fated to die at Troy, and also convinced the Trojan Antenor to steal the statue of Athena protecting the Trojans and give it to them. After those two, Dante speaks to one who isn't named, but by his deeds and place of origin we know that it's Guido da Montefeltro, a shrewd mercenary captain who eventually tried to change his ways and become a Franciscan friar, but returned to his sin when he advised Pope Boniface VIII on underhanded tactics to use in the latter's conflict with the Colonna family of Palestrina. The ninth pocket is that of those who cause division and schism, who are themselves carved up by demons with swords. Here Dante and Virgil see Muhammad, the seal of the prophets of Islam. As I mentioned before, Dante had no love for Islam, and, as was common amongst medieval Christians, he saw Muhammad as a heretic who perverted biblical truth, since Islam shares many stories and figures with the other Abrahamic faiths, including venerating Jesus, though differently than how Christians do. Many Christians believe that Muhammad had been a Nestorian Christian before he founded Islam. Next to the prophet is his cousin and son-in-law Ali, who might be there in connection to Islam more broadly, or more specifically to the Sunni-Shia split amongst Muslims, with Shias seeing Ali and his descendants as the Imams, the legitimate leaders of the Muslim community. Sunnis, however, disagree, though Ali is still important for them as well. Muhammad talks to Dante about Brother Dolcino, who was still alive but would be executed in 1307. Dolcino de Tornielli was the leader of a heretical group called the Apostolic Brethren, who would be the target of a crusade in 1305, with whom Muhammad seems to feel a sense of solidarity. The reason Dolcino, Muhammad, and Ali are all mentioned here rather than with the other heretics above is likely because of the division and open conflict that came as a result of their heresies. Next, they say Piero of Medicina, who supposedly sowed conflict between the Malatesta and Polenta families through gossip and made-up stories. Beside him is Gaius Scribonius Curio, a Roman senator who, according to Lucan, persuaded Caesar to cross the Rubicon, thus beginning the civil war with Pompey the Great. Nearby too is Mosca dei Lamberti, a Florentine who, in 1215, encouraged the assassination of Buondelmonte dei Buondelmonti, after he'd gone back on his promise to marry a member of the Amidei family, who were allies of Mosca's. This assassination was often seen as the beginning of the Guelph-Ghibelline split in Florence. After that, they see the troubadour Bertrand de Born, Lord of Hautefort, who, according to Dante, likely getting his information from fictionalized troubadour biographies, was the one to convince the younger King Henry of England to rebel against his father, his co-king Henry II, in 1173. Lastly, Virgil points out Geri del Bello, a second cousin of Dante's who was a known instigator of violence and was killed by a member of the Sacchetti family. Dante notes Geri's anger that his family had yet to avenge him, though that would happen in 1310. And now we get to the 10th and final pocket of the 8th circle, that of falsifiers, who are all suffering from various illnesses. We're first introduced to two alchemists, an unnamed man from Arezzo, who we know to be a certain Grifolino, and one named Capoccio, both of whom are condemned for fraudulent alchemy, that is, claiming they could do things with alchemy that they actually couldn't, or actively deceiving people with it, a common criticism levied against alchemists. Capoccio even notes that he was skilled at falsifying metals, i.e. making fake silver and gold. Next we see two impersonators, Gianni Schicchi, who impersonated Buoso Donati after his death to change his will in favor of his nephew Simone Donati, and Mira from classical myth, who disguised herself in order to become her father's lover. After them, we meet the counterfeiter, Master Adam, no relation, who made his fortune creating and circulating debased florins, the currency of Florence, which were supposed to be coins made from 3.5 grams of pure gold. Last but not least are the false witnesses, the first of which is the wife of Potiphar from the Bible, who tried to seduce the prophet Joseph, when he failed, she accused him of trying to rape her. The second is Sinon, another character from the Aeneid, who lied to the Trojans about the Greeks leaving and convinced them to take the wooden horse into the city. And with that, we're finally done with the 8th circle, but we've still got a little ways to go before the end. Approaching the 9th circle, Virgil and Dante see several giants chained up. They're here because of the war between the giants and the gods of Olympus in Greco-Roman myth, after which they were imprisoned in the underworld and beneath various mountains and volcanoes. It should be kept in mind that Dante's source, Ovid, conflates the giants with other enemies of the Olympians, including the Titans. For medieval Christians, the war between the giants and the Olympians was often seen as a parallel to that of the rebellious angels against God, which is probably why they're all the way down here, at the mouth of the Circle of Betrayal. 2 of the giants we meet here had taken part in that battle, Ephialtes and Briareus. Virgil also mentions another, Typhon, though he isn't seen. Similarly mentioned is Tityos, who tried to rape Apollo and Diana's mother, Latona, and was punished in the underworld by having his liver repeatedly eaten by vultures. Another giant who is seen, though, is Antaeus, who was the scourge of North Africa and was defeated in a wrestling match by Hercules. Finally, there's one figure here who may seem a bit out of place, Nimrod, the biblical figure who is typically seen as the king who had the Tower of Babel built, a tower meant to reach all the way to the sky, seen as hubristic by God. Today, Nimrod isn't typically seen as a giant, but he was often called one in the Middle Ages because of a pre-Vulgate Latin translation of the Old Testament, preserved through the writings of St. Augustine, that called him a giant upon the earth, where modern translations and the Vulgate tend to read mighty upon the earth. Antaeus carries Virgil and Dante down to the 9th and final circle, that of the traitors, who are frozen into a lake at the center of the earth. This circle is divided into 4 sections. The first is that of the traitors to their own kin, called Cana, after the biblical Cain who murdered his brother Abel out of jealousy over the fact that Abel was getting more attention from God. Here they see Napoleone and Alessandro, frozen side by side and butting heads. These 2 were the sons of Alberto, the Count of Mangara, who fought over their inheritance and wound up killing each other sometime in the 1280s. Next is Sassol Masceriari, a Florentine of the Tosci family who killed his cousin so that he could get the inheritance from his uncle. Finally, there's Umberto Carnicion de Pazzi, who killed his kinsman Ubertino to inherit his castles. Umberto says that he's awaiting Carlino de Pazzi, a traitor to the White Guelphs who'll surrender a castle after being bribed in 1302. Umberto also mentions 2 more who are in Cana but not seen. Mordred, the treacherous son of King Arthur by his sister Morgan le Fay, and Focaccia, or Vanni de Cancellieri of Pistoia, who killed either his father or his uncle, and was blamed for creating the division between white and black Guelphs. Umberto's mention of Carlino brings us to the next section, Antenora, named after the Trojan traitor Antenor, who Ulysses and Diomedes had convinced to steal the statue of Athena. This is the place for traitors to their country or faction. Here they meet Bocca degli Abati, a Ghibelline who avoided being driven from Florence in 1258 by claiming to support the Guelphs, who then sabotaged the standards of the Guelph Florentines at the Battle of Monteperti in 1260, which Dante sees as the cause of Florence's defeat and the re-emergence of the Ghibellines as dominant over the city. Bocca then names several other traitors, Puoso da Duera, who used French gold to bribe several Italian Ghibelline lords to allow the Guelph ally Charles of Anjou and his army safe passage during his war with Manfred of Sicily, Tesoro di Becceria, a papal legate to Florence who was executed after 1258 on charges of conspiring with Ghibelline exiles, Gianni de Soldanier, a Florentine Ghibelline who switched sides after Charles of Anjou's victory in 1266, which brought Guelph dominance, Ganelon, the stepfather of Roland in the popular Chanson de Roland, who was bribed to betray Charlemagne's army, which led to a massacre of the rearguard and to Roland's death, and Tebadello, a Ghibelline from Faenza who opened the city gates in 1280 for the Guelph Bolognese army so that they could kill his rivals in the city. Ending this section and transitioning into the next one, we see Count Ugolino della Gherardesca gnawing on the head of Archbishop Ruggieri of Pisa. Ugolino was a Ghibelline podesta of Pisa who opportunistically turned Guelph to strengthen his position. Ruggieri was the leader of the Ghibellines in Pisa after Ugolino switched sides, who sought to make peace between Guelphs and Ghibellines, but actually tricked Ugolino into a trap where he imprisoned the count and his sons in a tower where they starved to death, which is why Ugolino is going to town on the archbishop's head. Ruggieri's sin more closely fits in the next section, Ptolemaea, named after the pharaoh Ptolemy XIV, who had Pompey the Great killed while the latter sought refuge in Egypt. Here Dante sees brother Alberigo, another member of the Jolly Friars I mentioned back in the Pocket of the Hypocrites. In 1285, Alberigo held a feast, inviting members of his family, the Manfredi, with whom he had disputes over land. But in the middle of the feast, he had assassins come into the room and kill his guests. Dante points out that Alberigo wasn't yet dead, but Alberigo himself says that when someone commits such a great act of treason, their soul is brought to hell immediately, and their body remains under the control of a demon. Which wasn't orthodox doctrine at the time, but whatever. Dante's writing the story, he can make up the rules, I guess. The case is similar for Brancadoria, who killed his father-in-law Michele Zanche and his companions. Zanche was mentioned earlier as one of the corrupt Sardinian officials, after inviting them to a dinner. He's also here despite still being alive in 1300. But now we finally get to the deepest part of hell, the fourth part of the ninth circle, that of the traitors to their lords and benefactors. Here Dante sees Dis, aka Satan, the devil, Beelzebub, whatever you want to call him, stuck halfway in the ice, whose flapping wings are causing the whole place to be frozen. Satan is the original traitor. Once an angel, he led a rebellion against God, his Lord, and was cast down into hell as his eternal prison, along with the other rebel angels. Dis has 3 heads, each of them chowing down on a sinner: Judas Iscariot, Brutus, and Cassius. Judas was one of Jesus' 12 apostles, who betrayed him to the Roman authorities for 30 pieces of silver, allowing them to capture and crucify him. Brutus, descendant of the other Brutus back in Limbo, and Cassius were Roman politicians who led the assassination of Julius Caesar, whose betrayal is heightened by the fact that Caesar had pardoned them for siding against him in the Civil War. The betrayals of these 3, and their placement in the mouths of Satan, is closely tied to Dante's political and theological views. Judas represents betrayal of the church, Brutus and Cassius the betrayal of the Roman state. For Dante, both of these institutions were divinely sanctioned. The ideal world had the emperor governing all things secular, and the church all things divine. The chaos and evil in his own day are brought about by secularly focused clergy, and unruly factions free from imperial control. If you want to know more about this, I recommend reading Dante's Monarchia. With that, Virgil and Dante leave hell and make their way towards purgatory. And so this video finally comes to an end. It turned out a lot longer than I'd anticipated, so if you're still here, congratulations. I hope you thought this was fun, or at least interesting. I do plan on doing the whole Divine Comedy, so make sure to check out those other 2 videos when they're finally released. It might be a little while though, because this took a lot longer to make than I was anticipating. When I first came up with this idea, I hadn't read the comedy in like 7 years, so I'd forgotten just how many characters were actually in it. But I'm nothing if not disciplined. Anyway, as always, I thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.